The city had never been this quiet before, normally bustling with life. The streets now lay eerily still, not a single soul in sight. Sarah peered out the grimy window of her apartment, her heart pounding with dread. What was happening? Where had everyone gone? Suddenly, a movement in the distance caught her eye, her breath catching in her throat. As she recognized the shambling figures lurching towards her building, zombies, she breathed the word barely above a whisper, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Sarah had always scoffed at the idea of a zombie apocalypse, dismissing it as nothing more than a far-fetched fantasy trope in movies and video games. But now, staring out at the undead abominations converging on her home, she knew with sickening certainty that this was no work of fiction. This was real. And she was trapped right in the middle of it. Panic seized her as she scrambled away from the window, her mind racing with 1,000 panicked thoughts. Where could she go? How would she survive? What if they got inside? With trembling hands, she began barricading the door, jamming furniture and anything else she could find against it. If the zombies breached the outer defenses, she would have to make her final stand here in her own home. The thought filled her with a raw primal terror, but she knew she had no other choice. Gritting her teeth, she steeled herself for the fight of her life, glancing around the apartment for anything that could be used as a weapon. Just then, a loud crash echoed from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of tearing flesh and agonized screams. Sarah froze, every muscle in her body going rigid as a wave of pure dread washed over her. They were already inside the building, racing to the bedroom. She grabbed the baseball bat she kept under the bed and crouched down next to the door, listening intently for any sign of the approaching horde. The eerie silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying than the sounds of the attack. Her mind spiraled with horrific imaginings of what might be happening out there in the darkened halls. Swallowing hard, she tightened her grip on the bat, her knuckles turning white slowly. She inched the bedroom door open just a crack, peering out into the gloom. To her immense relief, the hallway appeared to be empty for now, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the undead found their way to her hiding spot. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she emerged from the room, bat in hand, ready to face whatever nightmares lurked in the shadows. As she crept down the hall, a sudden movement made her freeze in her tracks, her heart pounding. She raised the bat, ready to swing, but then she recognized the figure stumbling towards her. It was her neighbor, Jack, his clothes stained with blood, his eyes wild and unseeing. He let out a guttural moan and lurched forward, his rotting hands grasping towards her. Sarah recoiled in horror, realizing with a sinking feeling that her once friendly neighbor had now joined the ranks of the undead. With no other choice, she steeled herself and swung the bat with all her might. Jack's skull caved in with a sickening crunch, and he crumpled to the floor, unmoving. Sarah stared down at his lifeless body, tears welling in her eyes. He had been her friend. How could this have happened? Blinking away the tears, she knew she couldn't afford to dwell on her grief. Not when her own life was at stake. Tightening her grip on the bat, she pressed on down the hall, every sense on high alert for any sign of the ravenous horde that surely lurked nearby. The battle for survival had begun, and Sarah knew she would have to be relentless if she wanted to make it out of this nightmare alive. Creeping down the shadowy hallway, Sarah's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. The eerie silence was suffocating, punctuated only by the faint sound of her own ragged breathing. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement, any indication that the undead horde had not yet reached this part of the building. As she approached the stairwell, a faint shuffling noise echoed from below, sending a jolt of terror through her body. Quickly, she ducked behind a potted plant, crouching low and gripping the baseball bat until her knuckles turned white. Peering cautiously around the edge of the planter, she caught a glimpse of a figure lurching up the stairs. A zombie, its vacant eyes and gaping mouth sending a shiver down her spine. Holding her breath, Sarah watched as the creature shambled closer, its rotting limbs dragging across the floor. Just as it reached the top of the stairs, another zombie emerged from the shadows behind it, letting out a bone-chilling roar. Sarah's eyes widened in horror as the two creatures turned towards her hiding spot, their putrid stench burning her nostrils. Without a moment's hesitation, Sarah sprang from her hiding place, swinging the bat with all her might. The first zombie crumpled to the ground, Its skull caved in, but the second one lunged at her, its bony fingers clawing at her face. Caught off guard, Sarah stumbled backwards, barely avoiding its snapping jaws. Frantically, she swung the bat again, connecting with the creature's shoulder and sending it reeling. As the zombie recoiled, Sarah spotted a door just a few feet away, her chance to escape. Without a moment's hesitation, she darted towards it, wrenching it open and flinging herself inside, slamming the door shut behind her. Gasping for breath, she pressed her back against the door, her heart pounding in her ears. The room was dark, dimly lit by a single window. Sarah's eyes quickly adjusted, and she realized she was in some sort of utility closet, surrounded by cleaning supplies and old boxes. Cautiously, she moved away from the door, her grip on the bat never wavering. Suddenly, a faint rustling sound from the far corner of the room made her freeze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned towards the source of the noise, raising the bat in a defensive stance. To her surprise, a figure emerged from the shadows, a young woman, her eyes wide with fear. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman held up her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," she replied, her voice trembling. "My name is Lily. I was hiding from them." Sarah studied the woman for a moment, trying to assess whether she could be trusted. Lily's clothes were disheveled, and her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes that Sarah couldn't ignore. "How long have you been in here?" Sarah asked, lowering the bat slightly. "I'm not sure," Lily admitted. "A few hours, maybe. I heard the commotion outside and just ran in here, hoping to find a safe place to hide." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. If Lily had been in here for hours, it was possible that the zombies had already moved on, giving them a chance to escape. But she couldn't be sure, and the thought of venturing out into the hallway again filled her with dread. "We can't stay here forever," Lily said, as if reading Sarah's thoughts. "We have to find a way out of this building." Sarah hesitated, weighing their options. On one hand, the relative safety of the closet was tempting, but on the other, she knew that their chances of survival would be better if they could find a way to escape the city entirely. Taking a deep breath, she made her decision. "All right," she said, steeling her resolve. "Let's do it." Taking a deep breath, Sarah gripped the baseball bat tightly and slowly eased the door of the utility closet open, peering cautiously into the darkened hallway. It was eerily silent, with no sign of the undead creatures that had been there moments earlier. Lily hovered nervously at her shoulder, eyes darting around the shadowy corridor. "I think the coast is clear," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to move quickly and quietly. Stay close to me." Lily nodded, her face pale with fear, and the two women crept out of the closet, hugging the walls as they made their way towards the stairwell. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, every creak of the floorboards and every faint rustling sound sending a jolt of terror through her. As they reached the top of the stairs, Sarah paused, straining her ears for any sign of movement below. The stairwell was empty, but she knew that could change in an instant. Glancing back at Lily, she jerked her head, silently indicating that they should begin their descent. The stairs creaked ominously under their feet, and Sarah winced with every step, certain that the noise would draw the undead horde straight to them. But they pressed on, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere below, followed by a series of guttural snarls and the sound of tearing flesh. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Lily let out a muffled whimper, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the sound. "We have to get out of here," Sarah hissed, already turning to head back up the stairs. But as she did, a horde of the undead creatures came shambling around the corner, their dead eyes fixed on the two women. "Run," Sarah shouted, grabbing Lily's hand and pulling her forward. They raced up the stairs, their lungs burning, the zombies hot on their heels. Sarah could hear their snarls and the thud of their decaying limbs against the steps, and she knew they were running out of time. As they reached the top of the stairs, Sarah spotted a door leading out onto the roof. Without a moment's hesitation, she shoved Lily through it and slammed it shut behind them, locking it just as the first of the zombies reached the top. Gasping for breath, the two women stumbled across the rooftop, searching desperately for a way to escape. The city below was a sea of chaos, the streets teeming with the undead. Sarah's heart sank as she realized they were trapped, with no way down and no place to hide. Lily turned to her, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sarah gripped the baseball bat, her knuckles turning white. "We fight," she said, her jaw set with determination. "We fight to survive." With that, she turned towards the door, ready to face whatever horrors lay on the other side. Lily followed close behind, her own makeshift weapon, a metal pipe, clutched tightly in her hands. The battle for their lives was just beginning. The rooftop was a bleak, barren landscape, devoid of any cover or escape routes. Sarah and Lily huddled together, their weapons at the ready, as they scanned the horizon for any sign of salvation. The streets below were a chaotic mess of snarling, shambling figures, the undead horde that now overran the city. "There has to be a way out of here," Lily whispered, her voice quivering with fear. "We can't just stay up here and wait for them to find us." Sarah's mind raced, desperately searching for a solution. She knew that they couldn't hold out forever. The zombies would eventually breach the rooftop door, and then they would be trapped, with no way to defend themselves. Suddenly, a glimmer of hope caught her eye. In the distance, she could see a group of figures waving frantically, their movements drawing her gaze. Squinting, she realized they were other survivors, signaling for help from the relative safety of another rooftop. "Look," she exclaimed, pointing towards the distant figures. "There are other people up there. If we can make it across, maybe they can help us." Lily followed her gaze, a surge of hope flickering in her eyes. "You think they can get us out of here?" she asked, her grip on the pipe tightening. "It's worth a try," Sarah replied, her determination hardening. "We can't stay up here and wait for the zombies to find us. We have to at least try." Steeling herself, Sarah stepped towards the edge of the rooftop, searching for a way to bridge the gap to the neighboring building. The alleyway below was a dizzying distance, and she knew the jump would be a perilous one, but it was their only chance. "Okay, here's the plan," she said, turning to Lily. "I'm going to try to make the jump first. If I make it, I'll find a way to come back and get you. If I don't," her voice trailed off, unwilling to voice the unthinkable. Lily's eyes widened, her face etched with fear. "Sarah? No. It's too dangerous. We should find another way, or wait for help to come to us." Sarah shook her head, her jaw set with determination. "There is no other way, Lily. This is our only chance. I have to at least try." Before Lily could protest further, Sarah took a deep breath and stepped up to the edge of the rooftop. Gripping the baseball bat tightly, she steeled herself, then took a running leap, hurtling through the air towards the distant building. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah flew through the air, her heart pounding in her ears. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought she wouldn't make it, that she would plummet to the ground below. But then, her hands grasped the edge of the rooftop, and with a desperate surge of strength, she hauled herself up and over, collapsing onto the solid surface. Gasping for breath, she looked back towards Lily, who was staring at her with a mixture of relief and terror. "I made it," Sarah called out, waving her arm. "Now it's your turn." Lily hesitated, her face pale, but Sarah could see the determination in her eyes. With a deep breath, Lily began to run, leaping off the edge of the rooftop and soaring through the air. Sarah held her breath, praying that Lily would make it, and then let out a cry of triumph as the other woman landed safely on the rooftop, rolling to her feet. We did it, Lily exclaimed, her eyes shining with relief. Now let's go find those other survivors and get the hell out of here. Sarah nodded, her own fears momentarily forgotten. They had made it this far, and she was determined to keep fighting, no matter what horrors lay ahead. With renewed energy, Sarah and Lily sprinted across the rooftop, their eyes fixed on the distant figures who waved frantically in the distance. Hope surged through them, the prospect of rescue driving them forward despite the ever-present threat of the undead horde below. As they neared the edge of the rooftop, Sarah paused, her gaze sweeping the horizon for any sign of danger. The streets were a chaotic mess, the zombies swarming through the city like a living plague. But for now, the rooftop appeared to be clear, and Sarah led the way towards the adjoining building, her grip tightening on the baseball bat. Suddenly, a snarling figure emerged from the shadows, its decaying jaws snapping mere inches from Sarah's face. With a startled cry, she swung the bat with all her might, the impact shattering the zombie's skull and sending it crumpling to the ground. "Come on," she yelled, grabbing Lily's arm and yanking her forward. "We have to keep moving." They raced across the rooftop, their footsteps pounding against the concrete. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her breath ragged as they neared the edge of the building. Just as they were about to make the leap, a familiar figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking their path. "Jack." Sarah gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Hal." Her former neighbor stood before them, his features twisted in a malevolent grin. In his hand, he held a gun, the barrel pointed directly at Sarah's chest. "You're one of them," she breathed, realization dawning on her. Jack let out a chilling laugh. "Took you long enough to figure it out," he sneered. "I've been planning this from the start." Sarah felt a surge of betrayal, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of his words. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "I was infected days ago," Jack explained, his finger tightening on the trigger. "And now, I'm going to deliver you to the horde as a little offering." Sarah's blood ran cold, her heart pounding in her ears. She knew in that moment that this was no mere coincidence. Jack had been playing them all along, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Beside her, Lily let out a terrified whimper, her eyes darting around wildly. "We have to get out of here," she whispered, tugging on Sarah's sleeve. But Sarah couldn't move, her gaze locked on Jack's twisted face. "Why?" she asked, the word barely a whisper. "Why?" Jack echoed, his laughter sending a chill down her spine. "Because I can. Because this world is ours now, and the dead are the ones who will inherit it." Without warning, he raised the gun, the barrel trained on Sarah's head. She braced herself for the inevitable, her heart pounding in her chest. But just as Jack's finger tightened on the trigger, a sudden movement caught his eye, and he turned just as Lily swung her makeshift weapon with all her might. The metal pipe connected with the side of Jack's head with a sickening crunch, and he crumpled to the ground, the gun clattering from his grasp. Sarah wasted no time, leaping forward and snatching up the weapon, training it on her former neighbor. "You bastard," she hissed, her finger hovering over the trigger. "You're not taking us down without a fight." Jack groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "Do it," he rasped, a twisted grin twisting his features. "Finish me off. I'll see you in hell, Sarah." Sarah's hand trembled, her vision blurring with tears of rage and anguish. She knew she had to do it, that there was no other choice. With a deep breath, she pulled the trigger, the gunshot echoing across the rooftop. As Jack's lifeless body crumpled to the ground, Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Lily was at her side in an instant, her hand gripping Sarah's arm. "We have to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The others are waiting for us." Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant rooftop. With a deep breath, she turned and followed Lily, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just done. The battle for survival had taken an unexpected and horrific turn, and she knew that the worst was yet to come. Sarah and Lily raced across the rooftop, the gunshot still echoing in their ears. Their lungs burned, their legs aching. But they pushed on, driven by the desperate need to reach the safety of the distant survivors. As they neared the edge of the building, Sarah risked a glance over her shoulder, her heart sinking as she saw the horde of undead creatures shambling towards them, drawn by the sound of the gunfire. "Hurry," she shouted, grabbing Lily's arm and pulling her forward. "We have to make the jump." Lily's eyes widened with terror, but she didn't hesitate, following Sarah's lead as they leaped across the gap between the buildings. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she felt the air rushing past her, her muscles straining with the effort. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought they wouldn't make it, that they would plummet to the ground below. But then her hands connected with the edge of the rooftop, and she hauled herself up, collapsing onto the solid surface as Lily landed beside her. They lay there, gasping for breath, their bodies shaking with adrenaline. Sarah could hear the snarls and moans of the undead below, and she knew they had to keep moving. "Come on," she said, pushing herself to her feet and reaching down to help Lily up. "We have to find the others." They hurried across the rooftop, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the survivors they had spotted earlier. But as they reached the far side, they found themselves faced with a new obstacle, a high fence that stretched across the gap between the buildings. "No," Lily breathed, her voice thick with despair. "What do we do now?" Sarah's mind raced, her gaze darting around the rooftop for any possible solution. But as she looked back towards the way they had come, her heart sank. The undead horde was closing in, their soulless eyes fixed on their prey. "We have to find another way," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "There has to be another route, or a way to get over that fence." Lily nodded, her face pale with fear, and together they began to search the rooftop, their eyes peeled for any sign of escape. But as they moved, a sudden movement in the shadows caught Sarah's eye, and she froze, her grip tightening on the gun. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice sharp with tension. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Jack?" she gasped, her disbelief giving way to a surge of fear and betrayal. Her former neighbor stepped forward, a twisted grin on his face. "Hello, Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Did you really think you could escape me?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, her mind racing. How was this possible? She had watched him die, had pulled the trigger herself. But here he stood, alive and well, his eyes glittering with a dangerous light. You're one of them," she breathed, her heart pounding in her chest. Jack let out a chilling laugh. "Very good, Sarah," he said, raising his gun and leveling it at her head. "Now, it's time to join the rest of the horde." Sarah's world slowed to a crawl as the barrel of Jack's gun stared her down, his twisted grin sending a chill down her spine. Lily stood frozen beside her, her face drained of color as the realization of their predicament sank in. "How?" Sarah managed to choke out, her mind racing. "I saw you die. I watched you fall." Jack let out a menacing chuckle, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Did you really think a little gunshot would be enough to take me down?" he sneered. "I've been planning this from the start, Sarah. Ever since the outbreak began." Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as the pieces fell into place. Jack had been infected, had been one of them all along, and he had been using her and Lily as part of some twisted game. You're one of them," she breathed, the words catching in her throat. "All this time, you were leading us right to the horde." Jack's grin widened, his eyes glinting with malice. "Precisely," he purred. "And now, it's time for you to join them." Lily let out a terrified whimper, her hands shaking as she gripped the makeshift weapon she had used to strike Jack earlier. Sarah could see the desperation in her eyes, the realization that they were trapped, with no way out. Swallowing hard, Sarah steeled her nerves, her grip tightening on the gun in her hand. "I won't let you do this," she growled, her voice low and dangerous. Jack's expression darkened, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice," he hissed. In a split second, Sarah raised her own weapon, but before she could fire, Jack lurched forward, slamming into her with the force of a freight train. The gun clattered from her hand as they tumbled to the ground, Jack's hands closing around her throat. Sarah struggled against his iron grip, her lungs burning as she fought for air. Beside her, Lily let out a terrified scream, her pipe raised high as she charged towards Jack, intent on striking him down. But Jack was too quick, his reflexes honed by the virus that coursed through his veins. With a swift motion, he released his hold on Sarah and turned, catching the pipe in mid-swing. Lily's eyes widened in horror as he wrenched the weapon from her grasp, tossing it aside with a contemptuous sneer. "Pathetic," he spat, advancing on Lily with murder in his eyes. Sarah watched in horror, her mind racing as she searched for some way to save them. But as Jack raised the pipe, poised to deliver the final blow, a sudden crash echoed through the air, and the rooftop door burst open, flooding the space with a hail of gunfire. Jack froze, his head whipping around as the sound of boots pounded against the concrete. Sarah seized the moment, lunging for the gun that lay just out of reach. Her fingers closed around the grip, and she whirled, firing off a volley of shots at Jack's retreating form. The bullets tore through his shoulder, sending him reeling, but he managed to keep his footing, darting back towards the door. Sarah tracked his movements, her finger tightening on the trigger, but before she could fire again, a hand clamped down on her arm, yanking her back. "Come on," a voice shouted, and Sarah found herself being dragged towards the new arrivals. A group of heavily armed survivors, their faces grim and determined. As they pulled her and Lily to safety, Sarah cast one last look at the retreating figure of Jack, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and dread. The battle had only just begun, and she knew that the worst was yet to come. Sarah and Lily were ushered into the relative safety of the group of survivors, their limbs shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. The sounds of the undead horde still echoed from below, a constant reminder of the peril they faced. As the group tended to their wounds and regrouped, Sarah couldn't help but feel a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. These strangers had saved them from Jack's twisted plans, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were merely trading one set of dangers for another. What the hell happened up here? One of the survivors, a gruff-looking man with a military bearing, demanded. "We heard the gunshots and came as fast as we could." Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself to recount the horrific events that had led them to this moment. "It was one of my neighbors," she began, her voice trembling. He was infected, and he was using us as bait for the zombies." The man's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. "Infected? Huh," he growled. "Sounds like we've got a traitor in our midst." Beside Sarah, Lily nodded shakily. "He was going to deliver us to the horde," she added, her words barely above a whisper. The man let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head. "Figures. Ain't no honor among the living these days, is there?" He turned his attention to the rest of the group, barking out orders with the efficiency of a seasoned commander. "All right, listen up. We've got a horde of flesh-eaters knocking at our door, and a goddamn snake in the grass to deal with. We need to fortify this position and find a way out of this city. Fast." The other survivors sprang into action, securing the rooftop entrance and setting up a perimeter. Sarah and Lily watched, their hearts pounding, as the armed group prepared for the impending battle. "What about Jack?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "He got away. He could be coming back with reinforcements." The man's expression hardened. "Then we'll be ready for him," he growled, his hand resting on the weapon at his hip. "Nobody's getting through this alive except us." As the sounds of the undead horde grew louder, the tension on the rooftop reached a fever pitch. Sarah could feel a fear and determination radiating from the group each one of them steeling themselves for the fight of their lives. And then, the first wave of zombies burst through the door, their snarls and moans echoing across the rooftop. The survivors opened fire, their weapons blazing, and the air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and decaying flesh. Sarah and Lily huddled behind a makeshift barricade, their hearts pounding as they watched the battle unfold. The survivors were skilled and well-equipped, but the sheer number of the undead was overwhelming. Just when it seemed like they might be overrun, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. Jack, his face twisted with rage and his weapon raised high. He charged towards the group, his crazed laughter ringing out over the sounds of the battle. "You fools!" he howled, his eyes wild. "You think you can stop us? This world is ours now." Sarah's grip tightened on the gun in her hand, her finger poised on the trigger. She knew what she had to do, but a part of her was still reeling from the revelation of Jack's betrayal. Could she really bring herself to end his life, even after everything he had done? As Jack closed in, the other survivors turned their attention to him, their guns blazing. But he was quick, his movements fueled by the same virus that had transformed him into a monster. He easily dodged their bullets, his focus laser-locked on Sarah and Lily. With a cry of rage, Sarah stepped out from behind the barricade, raising her weapon. Jack's eyes widened, and for a moment, she saw a glimmer of the man he once was. But then he lunged forward, his teeth bared in a savage snarl. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah pulled the trigger, the recoil of the gun sending a jolt through her arm. Jack's body jerked, the bullets tearing through his flesh, and he crumpled to the ground, his eyes going dark. Sarah stood there, her chest heaving, her hands shaking. The battle raged on around her, but in that moment, all she could see was the lifeless form of her former friend. Lily was at her side in an instant, her hand gripping Sarah's arm. "We have to go," she urged, her voice trembling. "We have to get out of here." Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. She knew that this was only the beginning, that the fight for survival had only just begun. But as she followed the other survivors towards their escape, she vowed to never again be caught off guard, to never again let her guard down. The war for the city had commenced, and Sarah was ready to do whatever it took to emerge victorious.